from somebody who have insight eyes to look into the Bible, and that related also to why pre-tribulation is more biblical oriented compared to post-tribulation or tribulation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, one of the main reasons people hold on to the post-tribulation rapture is because they mix the church with Israel, and that is because they think the church is Israel right now. And that's why their understanding of Matthew 24, every time they read about Israel, they think it speaks about the church. And remember, as I taught Ruth earlier, the tribulation is for Israel's salvation. But if you think that the church replaced Israel, then now you think you are going to go through the tribulation. You got it all wrong. Now, make no mistake, the Bible is very clear on both the pre-tribulation rapture as well as the election of Israel and the fact that God never forgot about them. First of all, we just heard from Ruth that in the book of Micah and in the book of Zechariah, we could clearly see that Gentiles will still hold on to the Jewish people and go to Jerusalem. I mean, if God forgot about Israel, why would a Gentile hold on to a Jewish side of a garment? Why would he want to worship his God if there is no more Israel, if God replaced them? But I want to take you all the way to Romans chapter 11. In Romans chapter 11, the Bible begins, Paul was very well aware of the danger of replacement theology, even in the first century. And therefore, he said, he begins his chapter by saying, I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. And allow me to continue and go to verse 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not, he says. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. And then he says, now if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? In other words, he's saying, look, they may have stumbled and fell, but it's not final. Look, he's not saying they're out of the question, they're out of the game. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, and I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them, for if their being cast away is reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And then he says in verse 25, and this is the punchline, I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion. You see, what he says is, I'm going to reveal to you now a mystery. And if you don't understand this mystery, you will think you're wise. And those replacement theology people, they think they're wise. But look what he says. No, he says this, blindness in part has happened to Israel, but it's temporary. Look what he says, until, when the word until is there, it means it has an expiration date. Yeah. Then he says, until what? The fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so, he says, and look what's going to happen. All Israel will be saved. And then he says in verse 28, concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake right now. But concerning the elections, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. And verse 29, for the gifts and the calling of God are what? Irrevocable. Now, I don't see how a replacement theology professor can teach this and still hold on to a replacement theology. You understand? But this should be your flagship chapter to tell them that they're super wrong. And now, watch this. You go to Matthew 24, and you see the teaching of Jesus on the end times, and he's speaking of all the global catastrophes, and he speaks of the tribulation. Look what he says in Matthew 24. And it's very important that you understand that, because the language that he's using is this. Take heed, in verse 4, no one deceives you, for many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ. And look what he says, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And then look what he says in verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Look, he's talking about one nation that is going to be hated by all the other nations. And then many will be offended, will betray one another and hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise and deceive many, because lawlessness will abound and love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Look what he says. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached. And then he moves on. Therefore, when you see, who see? The abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel. Who is Daniel receiving his prophecy over? The prophecy of Daniel was for Israel, about Israel, regarding Israel. When you, Israel, see that standing in that place, then let those who are in where? Not in Jakarta, in Judea, flee to the mountains. You see, he's speaking to Israel. The entire description of the Great Tribulation in verse 15, all the way to 26. Look what he says. It's all a description of Israel, of the Sabbath, of Judea, of the mountains. How can you take that and put it on the believers, let's say in the Netherlands, that has no mountains? He says, go run to the mountains. Netherlands has no mountains. He talks about Judea. He talks about the Sabbath day. This whole thing is a description of how Israel will go through the tribulation. But when you think that you are the Israel, then you think you're going through the tribulation. Then what's left for you is to think that the rapture is post-tribulation. You see, one thing leads to another. And oftentimes, the misunderstanding of believers when it comes to Israel, the misunderstanding of believers regarding Israel leads them to misunderstand the rest of the scriptures. And that's why understanding Israel is the key to understand your rapture, to understand your role, to understand who you are, to understand your future. And that's, by the way, the reason I named the ministry Behold Israel. Look at Israel. Understand Israel. Because that's the key. And this is why in the same Matthew 24, he stopped. In verse 32, he says, learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. 2 days earlier, he already cursed the fig tree, if you remember. Same fig tree that was a symbol of Israel 2 days earlier is also here a symbol of Israel. He says that fig tree that lost all of his national privileges, that is going to be destroyed by the Romans, that same fig tree is going to come back to life. And he says, in the generation that will see the fig tree coming back to life, that generation shall not pass away. Now, what is your name?
Beatrix.
Beatrix.
Yeah, I met you there in the...
Yes, but Beatrix, I want you to know, you belong to that generation that shall not pass away.
Thank you.
Because why? Because you are watching the fig tree coming back to life. Now, what does it mean, shall not pass away? It means that we are the generation of the rapture.